Nobody in the office believed Emily was serious when she suddenly invited Ryan, a quiet, single-hearted man who had spent years keeping every colleague at arm's length, to her family's weekend barbecue. Ryan had never once accepted an invitation like that. Not in the 3 years he had worked there, not for a birthday party, not for a holiday potluck, not even for the retirement send-off of a man he genuinely respected. But what left him truly frozen was not the invitation itself. It was the moment, hours later, when Emily smiled in front of more than 30 relatives, took his hand without hesitation, and said the words that would rewrite both their lives. Ryan had never dated her. He did not yet understand that he was walking straight into a lie, or that the lie would eventually become the truest thing that ever happened to him. Ryan Bennett was 38 years old, and he had built his entire existence around precision. As a maintenance engineer at a mid-sized technology company, he was the person everyone quietly trusted to fix what could not be explained over the phone. The flickering server room, the broken elevator sensor, the air conditioning system that groaned every August like an old man complaining about his knees. He rarely spoke more than necessary, and when he did speak, people listened, because his words were never wasted on small talk or empty flattery. Years earlier, a marriage that had promised him a lifetime ended instead in silence and a signature on a piece of paper, the details of which he never discussed with anyone at work, not even the colleagues who had known him the longest. Since then, Ryan had quietly decided that closeness was a risk he no longer wished to take. And he built his days around routines that required nothing from anyone else, and asked nothing in return. He ate lunch alone at a corner table near the window, not because no one asked him to join them, but because he always politely declined, and eventually people stopped asking altogether. His apartment was small, tidy, and largely silent, filled with tools he rarely used anymore, and a single framed photograph he kept turned face down in a drawer. Coworkers occasionally speculated about his past, whispering theories in the break room about a tragedy or a betrayal, but Ryan never confirmed or denied any of it, preferring instead to let the mystery remain exactly that. His reputation as a reliable, competent, but distant man had settled over the years into something almost permanent, a fixed point around which the rest of the office simply orbited without expecting him to change. Even the newest hires learned within their first week that Ryan was the person to call when something broke, and equally the person not to invite anywhere social, an unspoken rule passed along quietly, like a piece of office folklore that nobody questioned. His manager once tried, gently, to convince him to attend a leadership retreat meant to build camaraderie among senior staff. And Ryan had declined so firmly, so politely, that the subject was never raised again. He preferred his weekends spent alone, running errands in a fixed and predictable order, repairing small things around his apartment that did not actually need repairing, filling the silence with the sound of tools rather than voices. It was not that Ryan disliked people entirely, but rather that he had come to associate closeness with eventual loss, and he had decided long ago that avoiding the former was the surest way to avoid the latter. Emily Carter was 34, a marketing specialist with an energy that seemed to light up every room she entered the moment she stepped through the door. She remembered birthdays, organized team lunches, and somehow managed to make even the most tedious project meeting feel bearable through sheer force of warmth and humor. People adored her, not because she performed kindness for appearances, but because she meant every gesture, every compliment, every small act of thoughtfulness she extended toward the people around her. From her first week at the company, she had noticed Ryan sitting alone near the window, and something about his quiet composure intrigued her in a way she could not fully explain, even to herself. She began finding small reasons to talk to him, asking about a spreadsheet formula she already understood, complimenting his fixed office chair, offering him coffee she claimed she had made too much of that morning. Ryan always answered politely, always briefly, and always in a way that gently closed the conversation rather than extended it further. Emily was not easily discouraged, however, and over the months that followed, she persisted in small ways, leaving a spare pastry on his desk during office celebrations, asking his opinion on minor decisions that did not truly require his input, simply to have an excuse to stand near him for a few extra minutes. Ryan noticed her persistence, though he never allowed himself to consider what it might mean, filing it away instead as simply another example of Emily's naturally generous character. The week before a long holiday weekend, the office buzzed with plans. Coworkers comparing travel itineraries and family obligations across cubicle walls in the loose, distracted energy that always preceded a long break. Emily, in her usual bright and unguarded way, turned to Ryan's desk and asked if he would like to come to her family's barbecue that Saturday. Mentioning it almost casually, as though the invitation cost her nothing at all, Ryan looked up, mildly surprised, and gave the answer he always gave to any social invitation, a polite and firm no, already turning his attention back toward the monitor in front of him. Emily did not argue, did not push, but she tilted her head slightly and asked a question that landed somewhere Ryan had not expected. Cutting through his usual defenses with unsettling precision, she asked whether he avoided parties because he genuinely disliked them, or because he was afraid of letting anyone get close enough to matter. Ryan said nothing for a long moment, his fingers frozen above the keyboard, the office noise around him fading into a strange kind of silence. He simply turned back to his screen without answering, and Emily, sensing she had touched something real, walked away without another word, leaving the question hanging in the recycled office air long after she had gone. For the rest of the afternoon, Ryan found himself unable to concentrate fully, the question resurfacing every time his mind wandered even slightly from the task in front of him. That night, Ryan sat alone in his apartment, turning the question over in his mind far more times than he wanted to admit to himself. He told himself it did not matter, that Emily's words were simply another attempt at friendliness, nothing more than a passing curiosity from a woman who was kind to everyone, regardless of how they responded. But sleep did not come easily that evening, and somewhere close to midnight, without fully deciding to do it, he picked up his phone and typed a short message to Emily. It said only that he had changed his mind, that he would come to the barbecue after all. He stared at the message for almost a full minute before sending it, his thumb hovering over the screen, and when he finally did send it, something in his chest loosened slightly, as though a door he had locked years ago had been nudged open just a crack, letting in a thin sliver of light he had almost forgotten existed. Saturday arrived with clear skies, and the smell of charcoal drifting through a quiet suburban neighborhood lined with well-kept lawns and children's bicycles, left carelessly in driveways. Ryan parked his car outside a large house with a wide front lawn, and even before he stepped out, he could hear laughter spilling from the backyard, dozens of voices overlapping in easy familiarity. Built over decades of shared gatherings, he had expected a small gathering, perhaps 10 or 15 people at most, but as he walked around to the back, he realized the true scale of what he had agreed to that day. There were parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins of every age scattered across the lawn, neighbors who had clearly been coming to these barbecues for years, children weaving between adult legs with paper plates, piled high with watermelon and burnt marshmallows. Ryan, who had spent years carefully avoiding exactly this kind of noise and closeness, suddenly felt the familiar urge to retreat toward the safety of his car, his hand instinctively reaching for his keys again. Before he could take a single step backward, Emily appeared beside him, her smile as bright as ever, though something in her eyes seemed tighter and more anxious than the version of her he knew from the office. She took his arm gently and guided him toward a quiet corner beside the garage, away from the crowd and the noise. And once they were fully out of earshot, her expression changed entirely, the easy confidence slipping into something far more vulnerable. She asked him for a favor, her voice lower and more urgent than he had ever heard it in all the months they had worked together. Ryan asked what kind of favor, bracing himself for something small. Perhaps help carrying supplies from the car, or setting up folding chairs along the fence line. Instead, Emily took a long breath, glanced nervously back toward the crowded yard, and asked him to pretend, just for the afternoon, that he was her boyfriend, someone she had been seeing for months, rather than a colleague she barely knew outside the walls of the office. Ryan stood completely still, certain for a moment that he had misheard her entirely. Emily rushed to explain before he could respond, the the words tumbling out faster than her usual measured cadence. Her family, she said, had been pressuring her about marriage for over a year, calling her almost weekly with names of men they thought she should meet, each conversation ending in the same gentle but relentless disappointment when she failed to show interest. Today, without telling her beforehand, they had arranged for a man named Daniel to attend the barbecue specifically to meet her, a kind of blind introduction disguised carefully as a casual family gathering, so she would not simply refuse to come if Emily arrived alone. She explained. She would spend the entire day being paired off and evaluated in front of relatives who meant well but never seemed to understand that she wanted to choose her own path in her own time. She looked at Ryan with something close to desperation, her hands twisting together in front of her, and admitted that of everyone she knew, he was the only person calm enough and trustworthy enough to help her through it without making the whole situation more complicated than it already was. Ryan hesitated, his mind working quickly through a dozen reasons to refuse. The risk of lying to strangers he would likely never see again, the discomfort of pretending affection he did not currently feel, the sheer unfamiliarity of the role being asked of him after years of deliberately avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement. But he also saw something in Emily's face that he recognized immediately, a kind of exhaustion that came from constantly being pushed into a version of life that was not truly her own, a feeling he understood far more intimately than he had ever told anyone. After a long pause, he nodded once, quietly, the way he agreed to anything important in his life, without excessive words, simply a decision made and honored without further discussion. Emily exhaled in visible relief, her shoulders dropping several inches, and before Ryan could reconsider or ask any further questions, she reached for his hand. Her fingers were warm and slightly trembling, though her expression had already returned to its usual confidence, a performance beginning the moment they stepped back into the open yard together, side by side. As though they had always walked that way, every head in the yard seemed to turn as they approached the center of the gathering, drawn by some unspoken family radar that noticed new arrivals instantly, the way small towns and large families always seem to know. Emily raised her voice just enough to carry across the lawn, smiling in a way that looked completely natural to everyone except Ryan, who felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes settle on him at once, pressing against him like a physical thing. She announced, simply and warmly, that this was Ryan, her boyfriend, and the words seemed to ripple outward through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water, spreading in slow, widening circles of reaction. For a brief second, there was silence, followed almost immediately by a wave of surprised murmurs, delighted exclamations, and the unmistakable sound of an entire family recalibrating its expectations in real time. Ryan forced a small smile and offered a polite nod, aware that his heartbeat had picked up in a way it rarely did, even during the most stressful server outages at work. Emily squeezed his hand once, a silent signal of thanks, though to any outside observer, it looked simply like the natural gesture of two people entirely comfortable with each other after months or years together. The questions began almost immediately, arriving in a rapid and good-natured barrage, from aunts, uncles, and cousins eager to learn everything about the mysterious new boyfriend nobody had heard mentioned before that day. Someone asked what he did for a living, and Ryan answered honestly that he worked in engineering and maintenance at the same company as Emily, keeping his answer simple and unadorned. Another relative asked how much he earned, a question he answered with careful vagueness, saying only that he made a comfortable and stable living, enough to support himself without difficulty. Someone else asked whether he owned a home, and he admitted plainly that he rented a modest apartment, a detail that drew a few quietly raised eyebrows among the older generation gathered near the drink table. More questions followed in quick succession, about his family background, his plans for the future, and, inevitably, when the two of them intended to get married, a question that seemed to interest the family far more than any other detail about him. Ryan answered each one with the same calm honesty he brought to every conversation, never boasting, never inventing details he could not defend later under further questioning, simply stating facts in his usual measured and unhurried tone. Emily stood beside him, laughing at just the right moments, filling in small details about their supposed relationship with impressive improvisation, though Ryan noticed the tension building slightly behind her eyes each time a question grew more pointed or specific. One of Emily's older cousins, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper memory for detail, studied the two of them for a long moment, then remarked, almost too casually, that they did not seem to look at each other the way people in love usually did. Emily's smile flickered for just an instant before she recovered it, quickly changing the subject toward the smell of the grill and asking loudly whether anyone wanted more corn, but the comment lingered in the warm afternoon air far longer than she wanted it to, settling uncomfortably into the back of her mind. Emily's father, a broad-shouldered man named Walter, had spent the entire introduction watching from a folding chair near the grill, saying almost nothing, his expression unreadable behind a pair of sunglasses he refused to remove even in the shade of the large oak tree overhead. Walter had a well-earned reputation within the family for being difficult to impress, a man who had built his own small construction business from nothing decades earlier and judged people primarily by the steadiness of their handshake and the honesty in their eyes rather than the smoothness of their words. Throughout the afternoon, he found small reasons to approach Ryan directly, asking pointed questions disguised as friendly small talk about his work ethic, his views on responsibility, and how he handled pressure when things did not go according to plan. Ryan answered each question without flinching, never exaggerating his accomplishments, never trying to impress Walter with anything beyond simple, unpolished truth. When Walter asked what he would do if he lost his job tomorrow, Ryan answered plainly that he would find another one, because he had never once relied on luck to carry him through difficult periods. When Walter asked what mattered most to him in life, Ryan paused for a moment before answering that stability mattered most, not the kind built on money, but the kind built on knowing exactly who you could trust. Walter said nothing in response to that particular answer, but something shifted almost imperceptibly in the set of his shoulders, a small, private recalculation taking place behind his sunglasses. While Walter conducted his quiet investigation, another guest arrived who immediately shifted the entire atmosphere of the party the moment he stepped through the side gate. Daniel Whitfield walked into the backyard with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own welcome anywhere he went. Dressed slightly too formally for a backyard barbecue, in a crisp collared shirt, his watch catching the sunlight with obvious and deliberate intention, he was the man Emily's family had arranged to introduce her to, successful in finance, charming in the practiced way of someone accustomed to being the most impressive person in any room he entered. When he spotted Emily standing beside Ryan, his easy smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Though he recovered quickly and approached with an outstretched hand and a voice full of confident, performative warmth, Daniel greeted Ryan with exaggerated friendliness that barely concealed a subtle undertone of mockery. Commenting on Ryan's simple clothing, his modest car parked outside near the curb, and his quiet demeanor, as though each detail confirmed something Daniel had already decided about him before they had even exchanged more than a few words. He mentioned, with a laugh clearly meant to sound casual, that he had just returned from a business trip overseas, dropping the name of a city known for its skyline, as though it might mean something significant to the people listening. Ryan absorbed the comments without visible reaction, responding briefly and politely, refusing to be baited into any kind of competition or one-upmanship. Emily's discomfort grew visibly with each passing remark, her jaw tightening, her hand finding Ryan's arm as though bracing herself against Daniel's persistent needling that showed no signs of slowing. As the afternoon wore on and the grill smoke thickened around them, curling upward into the warm summer air, Daniel leaned in with a challenging smile and asked Ryan, in front of several listening relatives who had gathered near the drink cooler, whether he truly loved Emily enough to prove it, whatever proving it might mean in Daniel's mind. The question hung awkwardly in the air, and several relatives exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to laugh it off or take it seriously. Emily opened her mouth to interject, to redirect the conversation the way she had done so skillfully all afternoon, but Ryan gave her the faintest shake of his head, a silent signal that he could handle this himself without needing rescue. Daniel, encouraged by the silence, pressed further, asking whether Ryan had ever bought Emily flowers. whether he knew her favorite restaurant, whether he could name a single trip they had taken together, each question landing like a small test designed specifically to expose the gaps in a relationship that did not exist. Ryan simply looked at him, unbothered, and said quietly that love was not something proven through a checklist of purchases and vacations, but through consistency, which was not something that could be demonstrated in a single afternoon to a stranger keeping score. Ryan did not answer with words. Instead, throughout the remainder of the afternoon, he simply began solving problems no one had explicitly asked him to solve, moving quietly and efficiently through the backyard, like a man following instincts sharpened by years of professional habit and quiet observation. When the grill's igniter refused to spark, sputtering uselessly under Walter's increasingly frustrated attempts, Ryan crouched down without a word, examined the connection, and had it working again within minutes, waving off the thanks that followed with a small, dismissive shrug. When a flickering porch light began to hum irritably above the back door, drawing complaints from a grandmother trying to read a recipe card in its glow, Ryan found the loose wire behind the switch plate and fixed it before anyone even noticed he had briefly left the group. When the pool pump in the backyard sputtered and died, drawing loud groans from the children eager to swim before the sun disappeared entirely, Ryan simply rolled up his sleeves, opened the housing panel, and had it humming steadily again in under 10 minutes, to the enthusiastic cheers of at least 6 delighted kids. Walter watched all of this from his folding chair, saying nothing, but his expression slowly softened from suspicion into something closer to quiet, genuine respect. One by one, other relatives began drifting toward Ryan with real warmth, offering him plates of food, asking about his work with authentic curiosity rather than interrogation, treating him less like a stranger under evaluation and more like someone who simply, naturally belonged among them. Sensing the shift in attention away from himself, made several more attempts to undermine Ryan's growing standing, offering backhanded compliments about his fixing things being a nice hobby, or joking that some men were better suited for repairs than for romance, laughing at his own joke a beat too long. Each time, Ryan simply nodded, unaffected, refusing to rise to the bait. And each time, the joke landed with noticeably less impact than the one before it, until Daniel's remarks began to sound more desperate than clever. Emily watched the entire transformation unfold with an expression she could not quite name. Something between surprise and a feeling she had not expected to encounter that particular day. She had asked Ryan for a favor, expecting an awkward performance to get her through a few uncomfortable hours before quietly slipping away. But what she witnessed instead was a man being entirely and unguardedly himself, and somehow that honesty was more convincing than any performance could ever have been. For the first time since they had arrived, she found herself looking at Ryan not as a colleague she barely knew outside a shared office, but as someone whose quiet steadiness felt oddly, unexpectedly comforting in a way she had not felt in years. Later in the afternoon, as the sun softened into a warmer gold and most of the guests drifted toward the shade of the porch to escape the fading heat, Emily and Ryan found themselves alone together near a folding table, arranging plates of food that no longer truly needed arranging. The performance, for a few quiet minutes, seemed to fall away entirely, replaced by something far more real and far more fragile. Ryan, without quite planning to, began speaking about things he rarely mentioned to anyone, about the marriage that had ended years ago, about the slow erosion of trust that had left him wary of letting anyone close again, about how he had built a small, controlled life specifically designed to avoid ever feeling that kind of loss twice in one lifetime. Emily listened without interrupting, something she rarely allowed herself to do given her naturally talkative nature, and when Ryan finished, she offered her own quiet confession in return. She admitted that despite being surrounded by so much family, so much noise and love and expectation, she often felt profoundly alone, as though everyone around her wanted a version of her they had already decided upon rather than the person she actually was underneath, all the smiling and organizing and remembering everyone's birthday. She told him, almost surprised by her own honesty in that moment, that in all her life she had rarely felt as safe as she did standing beside him that afternoon, even though the entire arrangement between them had begun as nothing more than a convenient lie. Ryan looked at her for a long moment, the noise of the party fading into the background, and for the first time all day, something unspoken passed quietly between them, something that neither of them dared to name just yet, though both of them felt it settle gently into place. That fragile, unspoken moment did not last long. Across the yard, one of Emily's cousins, a sharp-eyed young woman named Grace, had grown curious about the sudden appearance of a boyfriend no one in the family had ever heard about before that day. She began asking around quietly, first to Emily's mother near the dessert table, then to a few of the aunts gathered by the fence, wondering aloud why there were no photographs of the two of them together anywhere on any of their phones, no shared memories anyone could recall Emily ever mentioning in passing conversation. The questions spread through the gathering, the way questions always do at family events, quietly at first, whispered between chairs, then louder, until Grace finally approached Emily directly in front of a small cluster of relatives, asking bluntly how long the two of them had actually been dating. Emily froze, the easy confidence she had worn all afternoon suddenly slipping away like sand through open fingers. Replaced by a flush of guilt, she could no longer hide behind a bright smile. She glanced at Ryan, then back at her waiting family. Dozens of expectant faces turned toward her, and after a long, heavy silence that seemed to stretch on far longer than it actually did, she finally admitted the truth. She told them that Ryan was not actually her boyfriend, that she had asked him that very afternoon to pretend, simply because she could not face another day of being paired off against her will in front of people she loved, but who did not seem to understand her. The backyard fell into a stunned quiet, the kind that seems to swallow every other sound entirely. The distant birds, the sizzling grill, even the children's laughter fading briefly into the background of the moment as the news settled over the gathering. Walter's expression darkened with visible disappointment, not anger exactly, but something heavier and more complicated, the look of a father who had allowed himself to hope for something good and watched it dissolve in a single sentence. Daniel, standing nearby with a drink in hand, let out a short, satisfied laugh, clearly relishing the collapse of a rival he had never actually respected in the first place. Before anyone else could speak or pile on further judgment, Ryan stepped forward, his voice steady, despite the tension thick in the air around them. He calmly explained that the idea, and the deception, had been entirely his decision to agree to, refusing to let a single ounce of blame fall on Emily in front of her family. He apologized sincerely to Walter, and to the family gathered around him, for the discomfort his presence had caused on a day that was meant to be about celebration rather than confrontation. Then, with quiet dignity, he turned to gather his jacket from the back of a nearby chair, prepared to leave the way he had arrived, alone. Carrying whatever embarrassment the afternoon had produced without complaint or protest, Ryan had barely reached the front gate, his hand already resting on the latch, when he heard Walter's voice call out behind him, firm but no longer edged with anger the way it had been just moments earlier. He turned to find Emily's father walking toward him alone, having left the rest of the family still processing the revelation back in the crowded backyard. Walter stopped a few feet away, studied Ryan for a long moment through his sunglasses, and then said something Ryan had not expected to hear from him at all. He admitted that he had actually suspected the truth almost from the very beginning, long before Grace had ever raised her pointed questions in front of everyone. Ryan stood in confused silence as Walter explained himself further. His voice quieter now, more thoughtful. He said that he had noticed the slight unfamiliarity between them early on. The small hesitations that real couples rarely showed, the way their laughter had not quite synced up the way it does between two people who truly know each other. But what he had witnessed over the following hours, he continued, was something far more convincing than any staged relationship could ever have produced on its own. He described watching Ryan quietly fix the grill, the porch light, and the pool pump without ever once being asked, never seeking credit or attention for any of it, simply solving problems because they existed and he was capable of solving them. He spoke of how Ryan had endured Daniel's condescending remarks with more patience and grace than most men could ever manage under similar pressure. And how, throughout the entire afternoon, Ryan's attention had never strayed far from making sure Emily was comfortable and unharmed by the pressure surrounding her from every direction. Walter admitted that Daniel, despite his wealth and polish and confident charm, had spent the entire day speaking primarily about himself, showing little genuine interest in Emily, beyond how she might complement his own carefully curated image. He said that character, real character, revealed itself not in grand declarations or expensive watches, but in small, unwatched moments, and that Ryan had passed every one of those quiet tests without even realizing he was being tested at all. By the time Walter finished speaking, something in the family's collective mood had already begun to shift, words spreading quietly through the yard about what Walter had witnessed and what he now believed about the man his daughter had brought home. Emily, standing near the porch with her arms wrapped around herself, watched her father speaking with Ryan from a distance, her eyes glistening with an emotion she had not expected to feel that day, something like hope rekindling in a place she had long since given up on tending. She took a step forward, then another, unable to simply stand and watch any longer. Emily did not wait for Walter to finish his conversation entirely. She walked briskly across the lawn and out toward the front gate, her sandals slapping softly against the grass, catching up to Ryan just as he reached his car, his hand already resting on the door handle. One more time. This time, there was no performance left between them, no audience to convince, no careful script to follow or improvise around. She told him plainly that when she had introduced him to her family as her boyfriend, she had been lying, a desperate excuse born out of pressure and fear rather than any kind of truth she had planned in advance. Ryan listened quietly, bracing himself for whatever she intended to say next, uncertain whether this would be the moment the entire day quietly and finally ended between them. Emily took a small step closer, close enough now that he could see the slight tremor in her hands, and told him that she no longer wanted that introduction to remain a lie. She said the words carefully, her voice steady despite the vulnerability behind them, admitting that somewhere between the grill repairs and the quiet conversation by the folding table, what had begun as a simple favor had shifted into something she could no longer dismiss as pretend, no matter how hard she tried to convince herself otherwise. Ryan remained silent for a long moment, processing words he had not allowed himself to hope for even privately. And then, finally, he confessed something of his own that he had never spoken aloud to anyone. He admitted that he had noticed Emily long before that day, had watched her kindness toward everyone in the office, including himself, the way she remembered small details about people's lives, the way she never made anyone feel invisible, and had quietly admired her for months, without ever finding the courage to say so out loud. He told her that part of the reason he had agreed to come that day, even before she asked him to pretend anything, was that some small, hopeful part of him had wanted an excuse to spend more time near her. Neither of them spoke further after that confession settled into the space between them. Ryan reached out, and Emily stepped into the space between them without hesitation, and the embrace that followed carried none of the performance from earlier that day. Only the quiet relief of two people finally allowing themselves to feel something they had both been too afraid to name for far too long. From the porch and the yard beyond, several relatives had gathered near the windows and the open back door to watch, smiling softly at the unexpected turn the afternoon had taken from disaster into something quietly beautiful. Even Walter, standing near the gate with his arms crossed and his sunglasses finally pushed up onto his head, allowed himself a small, approving nod, the closest thing to a blessing he was ever likely to offer out loud in front of an audience. Grace, who had started the whole unraveling with her sharp questions, now stood grinning beside her mother, already texting the news to relatives who had left the party early and missed the entire unfolding drama. Several months passed before the story fully settled into what it had become. No longer a rumor whispered around the office coffee machine between meetings, but simply the accepted truth everyone had come to know and appreciate. Ryan and Emily began dating openly, first cautiously, testing the boundaries of a relationship neither had fully expected, then with the quiet confidence of two people who trusted exactly what they had built together from an unlikely beginning. Colleagues who had once seen Ryan as the silent man in the corner near the window now greeted him warmly each morning, occasionally teasing him gently about the barbecue that had somehow turned an entire office rumor into a genuine and lasting romance. Emily, for her part, seemed lighter than she had in years, no longer weighed down by the constant pressure to become someone her family expected, rather than the person she actually was underneath all the noise and obligation. She laughed more easily at her desk, lingered less anxiously over family phone calls, and found herself looking forward to weekends in a way she had almost forgotten how to do. Ryan, too, began showing small changes that his coworkers noticed but rarely commented on directly. Joining the occasional team lunch, offering a rare joke during a meeting, staying a few minutes longer at the holiday party instead of slipping out early the way he always used to. Eventually, Emily's family organized another barbecue, this time with no hidden arrangements, no secret introductions, no pretense of any kind required from anyone involved. Ryan arrived that day as exactly who he was, welcomed without suspicion, without interrogation, simply as Emily's partner, and, increasingly, as a genuine member of the extended family circle that had once studied him with such wary curiosity. Walter greeted him at the gate with a firm handshake and something close to genuine warmth in his eyes, a gesture that meant more to Ryan than any words could have expressed after a lifetime of keeping people carefully at a distance. Even Daniel made a brief appearance that afternoon, and to everyone's mild surprise, he approached Ryan directly near the drink cooler, admitting with unusual humility that he had misjudged him entirely on that first day, and that watching Emily's happiness since then had made the truth impossible to ignore any longer. The afternoon unfolded easily, filled with laughter that no longer carried any undercurrent of tension or judgment beneath it, children running freely between the same familiar chairs and tables that had witnessed the entire story unfold months earlier, the smell of the same grill filling the same warm summer air, as though nothing had ever gone wrong that first day at all. Grace, now firmly established as Ryan's favorite among the cousins, insisted he help her fix her bicycle chain before the afternoon ended. A request he happily obliged without a second thought. As the sun began to lower over the yard, painting everything in soft amber light the way it always seemed to at the end of these gatherings, Ryan turned to Emily, who stood beside him watching her family with quiet, unguarded contentment. He said, in his usual understated way, that the biggest lie either of them had ever told had somehow become the shortest path to finding the one person he was meant to spend the rest of his life beside. Emily smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the last of the daylight faded gently over the fence line. And neither of them said anything more, because for the first time in a long while, nothing more needed to be said at all. The family continued talking and laughing behind them, the grill still glowing faintly in the growing dusk. And somewhere in that ordinary, unremarkable evening, two people who had once been strangers pretending at love finally arrived. Quietly and completely at something real. Later that night, long after the guests had gone home and the folding tables had been stacked away in the garage, Emily sat on the porch steps beside Ryan, both of them tired in the pleasant way that comes only after a full and meaningful day. She asked him, half joking, whether he regretted saying yes to that very first message all those months ago, the one he had almost not sent at all. Ryan considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything, and told her that it was the only impulsive decision he had made in nearly a decade, and the only one he had never once regretted since. Emily laughed softly and leaned into him, and somewhere above them the porch light he had once repaired for a family of strangers now glowed steadily over a home that had slowly, unmistakably, become his own as well. In the weeks that followed, coworkers who once considered Ryan unreachable found themselves genuinely delighted by the transformation, though none of them could quite explain what had changed, only that something clearly had. He still preferred quiet mornings and short conversations, still fixed things without being asked, still avoided unnecessary attention whenever possible. But there was an ease to him now that had not existed before, a lightness that showed itself in small, unmistakable ways. Emily never stopped introducing him to new people with the same warmth she had shown that very first afternoon, except now there was no script to remember, no lie to maintain. Only the simple, comfortable truth of two people who had found each other by accident and chosen, deliberately and completely, to stay.